Welcome everyone, Croeso pawb. My name is Dr. Jonathan Woolley and I am a social anthropologist and a third degree initiate of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. I've been a member of the pagan community for getting on for 14 years now, and in addition to my pagan druidic spirituality being a central part of my personal life, it's also one of my main academic interests, and I've conducted a wide variety of field work with primarily with Druids in around the UK, specifically looking at the relationship of Druids to one another and to the wider natural environment. And my talk today is going to reflect a little bit on some of the topics that emerged in the course of my research, specifically looking at the character of the pagan community, how it works, how it's influenced by certain trends, and I'm also going to take a bit of time at the end to speculate a bit about its future. And it would be really great if during the Q&A after my talk we can take some time to discuss some of the issues that I raise here and maybe think about how we can intervene collectively to kind of manifest a better future for our community. So I suppose the first thing that I'm going to start off with today, and I think this is, it's always nice to sort of start an academic discourse by thinking about a central research question or a central problem. And for me, that problem is a paradox that if you look at the pagan community and you talk to pagans about their goals and their aims and their hopes for the future, what people often talk about is a longing for community. But when you look at what pagans actually do and have done over the past 50 years and look at how they behave, what you find is that when pagans organise themselves, they don't necessarily place a huge amount of emphasis upon community, at least when compared with other faith groups. Now, it's interesting to note that certainly by their own admission, pagans are highly individualistic. We don't necessarily place a huge amount of emphasis upon religious institutions. Things like seminaries and churches, large organised congregational forms of spirituality are not really our bag. And indeed, many pagans will say that that's explicitly something that they wanted to try and distance themselves from. And one of the main things that they wanted to avoid is some of the perceived abuses inherent in organised religion and the way that many organised religions, in the perspectives of those pagans, create. And what's interesting is, this isn't to say that as a result of this you don't see any community at all, but it's certainly characteristic to note that pagans have a much more paganism has a much more egalitarian structure generally, or if there are sort of relations of seniority, I suppose, they're often quite localized, focused within a small coven or within a small initiatory tradition. Then there is, and the relationship between the two is not like the relationship between, let's say, an ordained priest and a congregation, because effectively even people who are just new entrants into the coven are themselves looking to work towards becoming a high priest or high priestess themselves. And so there's a real focus, a real emphasis upon a sense that everyone can be their own priest, and that sort of structure is sort of exists in tension, if you like, with this, as I say, this kind of ambition, this stated ambition that many people in the pagan community tell me that they're looking to find others like them. They're looking to find like-minded people. They long to form temples, intentional communities, etc. They're often talked about as being these wonderful things. And yet, when you actually talk to pagan organisers, these are people who volunteer to organise moots and open rituals and gatherings, who are looking to actually, in some cases, set up seminaries, schools to teach chaplaincy, etc. They've actually and many people I've spoken to who are connected with the Pagan Federation will say that they actually have to put a huge amount of effort into creating community, and that actually they often face a significant struggle to do so. A lot of pagan events recently have actually struggled to attract people to actually volunteer to help run them. There's been a significant struggle to actually sell enough tickets for certain events that I've spoken to, with, in recent years, the number of people actually attending falling over time. And this is particularly marked, it seems, amongst younger people, so amongst people who are under the age of 40, i.e. my age. So the sort of absence of millennials within these community spaces and the general sort of falling number of attendees, and particularly the falling availability of volunteers, is a complaint that many pagan organisers who I've spoken to have complained of. And this is clearly not reflective, though, of a decline of interest in pagan traditions or indeed persecution. Although some pagan academics who I've spoken to have tried to explain this, have said that that might be going on, that you're seeing a decline in interest in witchcraft and druidry, etc., that paganism is going underground again. When all you have to do is direct your attention to social media to see that actually a lot of millennials and people in Generation Z, so people under the age of 40, are actually really, really interested and passionate in pagan practices. There's a huge amount of interest in tarot reading, in astrology, in witchcraft, spellcraft, connecting with the spirits of nature, real interest in things like herbalism and herb lore, i.e. all of the kind of features and hallmarks of pagan spirituality are incredibly popular online, particularly on Instagram and TikTok. You can see that people are really, really interested in these things and integrate them into their day-to-day lives. And what's also noticeable, so you might say, well, maybe this is fine, but maybe it's becoming more of a subculture, maybe public attitudes are kind of turning against paganism again. But again, you don't see any evidence of this. Due to the tireless efforts of organisations like the Pagan Federation, the legal protections that are afforded to pagans are greater than ever before in many cases, and particularly in the UK. And if you just look on the press coverage of the solstice and how that's of events like the summer solstice, and look at how that's changed over the past 50 years or so, it's switched from being this kind of sensationalist and often complete uncomprehending bafflement, often edging into hostility and scaremongering, and that has become replaced with often extremely positive and curious editorial stances and language being used in press coverage associated with the pagan community. It seems every year, whenever there's a solstice or Halloween, you see a flurry of articles that most of which are generally pretty positive, even in publications like the Daily Mail, which historically, for those of you who aren't from the UK, it's generally viewed as quite a conservative newspaper, and yet a lot of the coverage in the Telegraph of pagan groups has been pretty positive. So it's interesting to see how the tone has kind of gradually shifted publicly, and how it's also not easy to it's pretty easy to see why, when you consider the fact that with the environmental crisis and with the gradual decline of involvement in official religion, membership of the Church of England, etc., it's quite clear that people are feeling much more inclined to take seriously spiritual traditions which offer a broad set of theological horizons, are open and exploratory, and also highly respectful of the natural world, which is a very common feature of many different forms of pagan spirituality, though by no means universal. Particularly with the interest in queer identities and the continued relevance of feminism, it's very clear that a form of spirituality, again, like many forms of paganism, that are welcoming and honouring of gender equality and of diversity in one's gender and sexual identities. Therefore, it's easy to see why people would be increasingly open and curious about pagan spirituality as a result. So instead, perhaps it might be possible then to argue that rather than the paradox indicating that that there are simply fewer people getting involved in paganism and so the pagan community is suffering, it's actually that pagans don't really like or want community. Maybe that there's some degree of bad faith going on here, that pagans might say that they want community but don't really want it. They're not serious about it. And yet I'm not really convinced by this either. In spaces that I've gone to, places like camps, people genuinely seem to express a sincere love and affection and enjoyment for the experiences they're getting in those kinds of spaces, and seem to really miss them when they don't take place, as they haven't for the past 2 years now because of COVID, and people have expressed a real sense of loss and a real sense of grief over not being able to participate in these kinds of community spaces. So today, my kind of question, and the thing that I will sort of address in the next kind of next 30 minutes, is why. There's no specific moral injunction. So pagans are not going to be trying to kind of win some degree of, they're not trying to conform with some kind of principle of the faith that says they have to like community. So it's not like it can't be attributed to desirability bias. But given that paganism has this kind of tolerance of individualism, it's surprising that pagans would express such a longing and desire for community, and yet for that not to necessarily be translating into a sort of a thriving expression of community that we might expect to see based on that stated desire. So my goal today is going to be to try and explain some of this, some of these tensions, and to tease them out, because only once we've done this can we actually understand how the pagan community might actually change in the future. So one of the things that I want to start from here, and perhaps this will help explain why this paradox is kind of hard to explain or understand, is that pagan studies scholars have tended to focus their energies on studying the content of pagan beliefs and practices regarding things like folklore, the environment, rituals, dance, mythology, all that sort of stuff. So there's a real focus on content of pagan spirituality. And this is a reflection of the central problematic of pagan studies, first shown in the writings of Tanya Luhrmann, who published Persuasions of the Witchcraft in 1990, to essentially grapple with a central question, which is, if pagans are normal, professional people, why do they do such strange, irrational things? And this kind of framing of the problem, the kind of central question for pagan studies that Luhrmann fleshed out, it was responding to a widespread notion, even amongst social scientists back then, that pagans were simply suffering from delusion or psychosis. These were, the reason why pagans honour the gods and the goddesses and practice magic is because they're crazy. And the goal that Luhrmann set herself was to say, no, they're not like that. These are perfectly normal, functioning members of society who are doing magic and divination and worshipping the old gods. So let's try and actually take them seriously, not just kind of peddle these ideas that it's these false representations, and actually, take pagan spirituality seriously and understand why this, putatively quite eccentric and unusual set of practices is taking hold within so many people's lives. And so what this sort of had the inadvertent impact of doing was kind of drawing scholarly attention to the ways in which pagans are unusual, so i.e. the content of what they think and do, rather than the ways in which they are like the rest of society, which, as Luhrmann herself acknowledges, is a key feature of what pagans and witches and other magical practitioners are like. They are like other people. They're ordinary, normal members of society in pretty much every respect. So what this meant is it kind of meant that the attention, if you like, of pagan studies was trained away from the more mundane elements of how paganism is organised. So therefore, it therefore stands to reason that if the pagan community is essentially much like any other community, what you would expect is that if people if pagans are like most people, then the British pagan community would be hugely shaped by broader socio-cultural and socio-economic trends that affect Britain as a whole. We're not necessarily going to be exempt from, trends in the economy and changes in the way that people between different age groups interact and the way that power relations are thought to work in British society. We're not going to be exempt from any of that just because we happen to honour the gods and the cycle of the seasons, right? We're still, like other people in Britain in many respects. And so essentially what has happened is that by neglecting the kind of less unusual bits of pagan spirituality, like how money and power circulate within pagan community, it's easy for scholars to neglect some of the key driving forces that determine the basic ways in which the community actually works. So what are those basic forces then? What are these key driving factors that we see? So when you turn your attention to those things, when you start, for example, as one might put it, following the money, what becomes really apparent is that the pagan community depends heavily on commercial exchange to attract new followers and to disseminate ideas. So although you do have some initiatory traditions, I'm thinking particularly British traditional Wicca, that don't charge for training in all cases, that tendency of conveying teaching on the basis of for gratis without any money changing hands is not the norm. Whether you're talking about shopping for spell recipes, subscribing to distance learning courses in Druidic practice, which is how I got involved in Druidry, or heathenry being religion with homework, i.e. religion that requires that you go out and get hold of books and read them in order to find out what the historic practices were. It's self-evident that the primary way in which pagans gain access to training and the materials they need to practice their faith is by buying them. And indeed, writing, publishing, selling and reading books, blogs and other written content is perhaps like the key means by which paganism has actually spread. So books about witchcraft, books about nature-based spirituality, cunning craft, Western esotericism, meditation, divination, etc. These are effectively a multi-million-pound industry that generate a huge amount of turnover every year. And so even though pagans in Britain are usually quite left-wing on the whole, and criticisms of capitalism are actually pretty common in pagan groups, I've overheard many, paganism is itself actually a really excellent example of the privatization of religion. If you wanted to create a religion that was entirely run by the private sector, paganism is a really good example of it. But I really should make a couple of caveats here. Firstly, I'm not suggesting that people who are actually generating this content, or even the companies that are generating this content, that is, these books and candles and statues, incense blends, tarot readings, etc. I'm not suggesting that these people are mainly in it for the money. I don't want to try and make anyone who sells readings online or has written a book as some kind of profiteer, right? That's certainly not what I'm trying to suggest here. It's pretty clear, actually, when you talk to people who produce content for sale, that their primary motivation is actually love and enthusiasm for the practice itself, rather than profit. And many people have said to me, I'd love to be able to do this for free, but and in fact they often do. They'll often, knock down the prices, or they'll, offer their support without charge to people who really need it. But often they don't have a choice. They've got bills to pay, they've got rent to pay, they need to buy food and supplies and all of the things they need in order to keep doing what they're doing. So there is a big contrast here, and I should say, between this and the way that most New Age practitioners tend to do things. And indeed, there's a common adage that people will would say to me, which is, the difference between paganism and the New Age is you add a couple of noughts onto the end of the price tag attached to everything. So I think probably the best way, if you want to, but the fundamental point is that doesn't make paganism not based on the market. It doesn't change that fact. All it does is mean that pagans are running different sorts of businesses, basically. So a good way to think about it is the difference between paganism and the New Age is the difference between a much-loved family business that has been doing what it's been doing for decades and believes very passionately in, let's say, an artisanal bakery that uses old family recipes versus a, multinational baking company that has branches in major cities all over the world and is primarily is like an entrepreneurial gig that is looking to apply new and innovative ideas to the art and practice of baking. Right? The primary motive is different, but the fundamental way in which those organisations operate is very similar. So even though they're not chasing ever greater returns, then even though they're not chasing ever greater returns, fundamentally everything about paganism relies upon the buying and selling of goods and services. But obviously there are large parts of the pagan community, such as moots, blogs that are published for free, public rituals, that are run either for free or at cost. The Pagan Federation, brilliant example of this. Those responsible for these spaces often exert huge amounts of effort to try and keep costs down, and will often work for free. The majority of people who run events like this are not paid, they're volunteers. And what that does is that actually keeps costs down, because the most expensive thing about running any organisation is almost always labour. Labour is the most expensive thing. And the thing that fuels this voluntarism is passion and enthusiasm. But it's important to remember that, again, this is by no means unusual, and no means a sign that something isn't primarily based on the market. So many creative fields in our society see people donate thousands of hours around what is necessarily fundamentally a capitalist enterprise. A fantastic example of this is actually, fandoms like Star Trek. Star Trek doesn't actually stop being a commodity that makes paramount millions just because there are lots of fans who dedicate countless hours to celebrating the franchise for no money, right? Just because Trekkies aren't paid to be Trekkies, that doesn't mean that Star Trek isn't a product of a fundamentally capitalist arrangement. And this comparison is actually pretty apposite, because in many respects, the pagan community actually resembles a fandom. It's a community founded on empathy and camaraderie that forms around a specific common interest, namely paganism and witchcraft and druidry, etc. So it's particularly striking, in fact, that some of the largest pagan events, like Pantheacon and Witchfest, actually closely resemble big fan conventions for fandoms. But another possible comparison that we could think about is an academic field. The pagan community is, essentially like many academic fields, is united by certain shared debates and questions and literary genres, and consists of people reading around a common subject and seeking various degrees of initiation, i.e. similar to a university degree, to demonstrate their level of understanding. But unlike most academic disciplines in this country, paganism doesn't have any access to essentially state funding, nor does it have access to big kind of grants given by private companies to fund research. So essentially, we are entirely reliant upon the money that we can stump up as participants within this field. So we all need to kind of get outside jobs in order to kind of fuel our what is essentially our spiritual hobby. So I think the best illustration of all of this, though, is the fact that the central hub of our community has for such a long time not been a church or a temple or a monastery or a roadside shrine, but the independent bookshop. These spaces have long served to not just disseminate pagan teaching and sell materials we need for our practice, but they also create community by providing often an affordable venue for holding pagan events and advertising in a public and really accessible way that the pagan community exists, that it's open for business, and that people and helps direct people to the right kinds of community spaces for them. So you can go into a pagan bookshop, you can talk to the nice person behind the counter, and they will be able to direct you to a nearby coven or a nearby heathen blot, or indeed any of these kinds of spaces of community. And they can give you advice, which is really, really precious. So, and I want to try and highlight, none of this should take any of us by surprise. because a kind of common adage in the social science of religion is that religions tend to take on the dominant institutional forms of the society from which they emerge. So if you look at apostolic Christianity, for example, it borrows heavily from the structures and spaces that were prevalent at the late stages of the Roman Empire, because that was simply the dominant social form that early apostolic Christians were dealing with. Right down to things like the name basilica, which is actually the ancient Roman word, it's the ancient Latin word for large public buildings. So the fact that we have churches that are called basilicas is an indication of how much borrowing of Roman imperial structures was going on within the pagan community, within the Christian early church. So, therefore, it's really not surprising that when a new religious movement or a set of new religious, setting aside the question of, the transmission of traditional spiritual ideas into paganism via cunning craft and so on, that these new institutions and newly sort of minted community spaces, if you like, where the people building them are working within a highly capitalist social context, it's really the easiest thing in the world for us to borrow from the preeminent social forms that exist around us, namely the marketplace, right, when we actually go about organising our own community. And I don't think that this is something that's been conscious. I think it's actually been very unconscious. We've literally just we want to access certain ideas, we want to create certain spaces to express those ideas, and so what we do is we simply borrow the forms that we're most familiar with and kind of retrofit them to achieve this new end. So what can this tell us about some of the patterns that I observed earlier? So this tension, essentially, that I established between people wanting to form community, but then people perhaps not getting involved in some of its expressions in the way you might expect. So the first point to note is that markets are by their nature really volatile, and the intimate involvement of pagan spirituality with this wider free market, especially sectors like retail and publishing, have left us really exposed to the economic headwinds that are affecting those sectors currently. So I want you to think about all of these dire headlines about the decline of the high street and of all of the changes in the publishing industry which are being wrought because of the actions of big internet-based e-commerce companies like Amazon, and then think about the implications that that might have on community spaces that were set up before those changes happened and were set up to rely on businesses that are essentially being outcompeted and driven out of business by the sort of flourishing of e-commerce. Because in the past 20 years, the internet has completely transformed both retail and publishing. E-commerce companies like Amazon have stolen market shares away from the high street, causing a huge number of independent shops, especially bookshops, to go out of business. And what this has done is it's essentially deprived our community of a lot of our most important spaces, community spaces, especially a shop window. And so there's now no clear pathway for someone to move from being a seeker, right, to migrating into the tradition and finding local expressions of community. And so it's really hard to actually get advice on who the people are locally that you might want to go and talk to. And this information is often available online, but it's often not really very easy. A lot of the information online is often not especially dubious. It's often a lot of the information you find online might be dubious or out of date, and it's also not clear when you go to a website, for example, and look for details of certain moots. You don't necessarily know what that moot is going to be like, and so it's a bigger leap to go from looking at the information of a moot on a website and actually going along to the moot than it is going along to a shop, getting the advice of the nice person behind the counter, and then they can talk to you a little bit and get a sense of what your specific needs are, and then give you a much more particular steer. That's a much stronger kind of, helping hand, if you like, to get people involved in the community than simply looking something up online and googling it and then deciding to go off the basis of that. And it's also worth remembering that the broader economic climate has also changed hugely. People are working much longer hours now, more women are in work, and we need to pay for more accommodation, and we've got less job security. Access to welfare has also become monitored much more stringently, so you have to spend a lot more of your time, doing things like filling in paperwork and applying for jobs. And so all of these factors have created obstacles for people who might once have actually attended and volunteered in civil society spaces a lot more regularly, including pagan civil society spaces. So and I think it's important to note about this, and I think this is something that we often don't tend to reflect upon. Whenever you attend an event in person, that comes with certain costs. Whether or not it's the cost of the time it takes to travel to the place and to pay for your travel, the small cost of entry, normally only a couple of quid, the risk of getting an experience that's not what you're looking for, and the time that you might have otherwise spent doing something you enjoy. So all of those things, those costs might not be huge, but the key thing to remember is that social media comes with none of those costs, right? You're browsing it from the comfort of your own home. It gives you a very carefully curated experience, so you don't need to subject yourself to the risk of an experience that you really don't like or that's really not for you. And I found evidence of that factor, meaning that social media is basically undercutting civil society spaces right across British public life. So where essentially, when I was doing my fieldwork looking at community in the Broads National Park, it was really clear that a lot of people were just not participating in a lot of voluntary spaces because they just didn't really feel that they had the time, and also they didn't really feel as though it really compared favourably with socialising online as much. So effectively, you're getting a situation where Facebook is kind of undercutting the pagan community, or at least when I say the pagan community, I mean in-person attending events and going along to regular spaces that are pagan in nature. So essentially what's happening is that the energies of the community are moving increasingly online to social media rather than being in person. So, and the way I would kind of characterise this is that the marketplace format that a lot of the in-person pagan community has relied upon has ended up leaving us unable to preserve those in-person spaces and insulate them from the impacts of wider economic and social changes. So the paradox arises because pagans do genuinely want community, but the tools that we once used to create it, the pagan bookshop, these voluntaristic kind of regular meetings that were organised for free by passionate hobbyists, essentially, are being overtaken by really severe economic pressures. And this vulnerability has become quite acute in the case of some events, forcing, unfortunately, some camps, some regular public rituals, and some conferences to shut their doors and unfortunately to be cancelled. And what's interesting is that especially during, and what this vulnerability has been really highlighted by COVID. Because effectively these relatively informal, these quite sort of loose associations that are heavily dependent upon retail have basically meant that as COVID restrictions came into force, a lot of our events simply stopped in a way that they didn't for other religious communities. Although during the first two lockdowns, church services couldn't be held, that was not true for the most recent lockdown. A special exemption was made. And also, religious organisations were able to provide pastoral support for their congregations in a very active way throughout the pandemic. And as I'm going to talk about in a second, the pagan community has kind of done the same and has adapted quite impressively to some of the pressures and challenges of COVID. But I think that we were still left way more exposed to a lot of the restrictions and the impact of the restrictions because of the relatively loose kind of connections that the kind of market-based model of pagan community has left us with. So let's so let's reflect a bit on what the implications might have been for the future. So the basic foundations, as I've been able to reveal, that the basic foundation upon which our community has been built is the market. This supports a couple of predictions and recommendations about our shared future. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the marketplace as a model is that there is a sort of a divine tint to this, because the primary patron of magical practice in the Western mystery tradition is the god, in the Greek tradition particularly, is obviously the god Hermes. And the god Hermes is also the god of commerce. So in a way, the hermetic tendencies of the pagan community have kind of, in a way, kind of represent almost like a very satisfying closed loop, where we have combined magic and the market in a way that has generated certain community possibilities, but has, as I've said, also left us open to the mercurial qualities that are inherent in the marketplace. And that's not necessarily something that we need to avoid. As I say, this is not I don't want to turn this into a sort of a point about maybe disenchantment, the idea that the market has sucked all the magic out of paganism, because I think the markets can be sacred too. And this could be something that we could decide to lean into and say, actually, we should embrace the fact that, and acknowledge the fact and plan for the fact that we operate on this kind of radical free market basis. I'm not sure that we do want to do that. I'm not sure that we really want to. I don't think that's actually where our mentality as a community is at. But I'm saying that is a possibility. That is something that people could choose to do if they so wished, and could say, yep, we want to, really, really, really focus on essentially accepting and working with the market-based basis of contemporary paganism. And if you want to do that, then what I would suggest is this. Think about your pagan community space as primarily a going concern, as primarily a commercial activity. Think about profit. Think about the way that you're running your business. Look at other organisations which are essentially doing something roughly similar to you. So if you are writing books, look at what books are selling most. If you're looking at, producing incense blends, look at people who look at companies that sell similar things like, home fragrance companies, etc. There's a lot to be learned from kind of extending your gaze outside, like not just assuming that your situation is going to be completely unique because you're coming at it from a spiritual perspective rather than purely a sort of a disenchanted, market-based, humanistic perspective, as it were. So that's one possibility. And as I say, I'm not particularly keen for that outcome myself. Not a big fan of the idea of free market religion, but it is an option that is available to people. And I think the other thing to take from this, and I think the thing that we should be taking heart from about this, is that the content of paganism appears to be going from strength to strength. So people are becoming more and more interested in what we are all about. It's becoming more relevant to the dominant themes of the present moment. People searching for identity, and a longing and a sense of belonging, but people also being extremely frightened about our relationship with nature, and the balance of harmony which exists between humans and non-humans being perturbed by carbon emissions and by existing patterns of land use. And paganism has a lot to speak to that. It offers a framework for reconnecting people and nature that I've explored quite a bit in my own research. And if you look at what's going on social media, people are responding to this. People are really, really connecting with pagan ideas. But we shouldn't necessarily assume that just because people are interested in what we're doing, that therefore means that is going to immediately and naturally and organically feed into what we call the pagan community, these in-person spaces that we've all grown up with and we all love. I actually would say we need to put the effort in, if we are serious about wanting to try and create a non-capitalist set of spaces, a set of spaces, well, not non-capitalist, but a set of non-market-based places, which are not dependent upon buying and selling, then we need to actually put some effort in and actually plan with that in mind. and figure out ways of translating some of that broad public interest that's kind of gathering at the moment. And again, this is my recommendation is going to be the same. Look at other organisations that are doing similar things to you and try and learn the lessons of what they're doing. So if you want to not operate on a for-profit basis, look at not-for-profits. Look at what works for different not-for-profits, even if they're not pagan, right? Don't just assume that the way that you need to operate is going to be fundamentally different because you're pagan, because it won't be. The people who are in your organisation and the demands acting upon your organisation or your space or your forum or whatever it is you're creating are going to be exactly the same as any other organisation, regardless of its content. There's going to be, as long as it's kind of fundamentally constituted in the same way. So although COVID, as I said, has kind of exacerbated our vulnerability to broader economic trends, once the high street shops and outdoor public gatherings were shut down, our community basically was as well. A lot of resilience has also been demonstrated. And one of the ways in which I've seen this is by events being moved online and actually as a result being opened up to a much wider audience. And again, I think this is an example of kind of leaning into the changes that we're seeing at the moment and actually embracing some of the changes that we're seeing in wider society and sailing with the wind rather than trying to kind of ignore it entirely, which is what I think as a community, as a collective, we've been doing to an extent. And so essentially, embrace the fact that the pagan community is moving online. Figure out ways and new ways of turning the internet into a place which is actually really generative of pagan spirituality. And it might even be that it becomes the new foundation for pagan spirituality. That is another possibility for a future. The fulfillment of the kind of techno-pagans that I used to hear about on things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so the other point I want to make as a conclusion is that it's also really clear that when pagans express this heartfelt longing for community, they're not acting in bad faith. Instead, what I would say is going on is this heartfelt and I would say probably universal human desire for community, for belonging, and particularly for in-person expressions of that, is sincere, but it's being caught up and in many respects being kind of like guided by these broader economic trends. And I think we need to plan with those trends in mind rather than just allow things to emerge organically, which is how I think things have gone to date. I don't think that as a community we've gone, we're living in a wider capitalist context, so how can we think strategically about how to kind of build something different in contrast to that? I don't think that's really happened. I think instead we've allowed things to develop organically, and to a certain extent that has left us vulnerable. And so I think we perhaps need to start being a bit more strategic about how we respond to fluctuations in wider society, and then really use that strategic understanding to genuinely manifest the community that we genuinely want to see. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to getting any questions.